Hello, everybody. So we've reached the last session of this wonderful book fair. And like everyone else, I must thank Petros for convening such a large group of scholars coming from different countries and disciplines, all working in the larger field of Byzantine studies. It gave us an overview of how lively the field is, and even if it's only a fraction of the recent publications concerned with the Byzantine world, it represents a very good slice of them. In the field of late antique and Byzantine studies, one research area has thrived these last decades, that of childhood and family history. The book I'm going to present fits in this trend, and it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Caroline Schroeder and her latest book, Children and Family in Late Antique. I don't know if you see that here. In a late antique Egyptian monasticism, published at Cambridge University Press this year. Caroline is professor of classics and letters at the University of Oklahoma, where she is also a member of their interdisciplinary data scholarship initiative. Prior to the University of Oklahoma, she was professor of religious studies at the University of the Pacific and served as director of the Humanities Center in this university. She received her PhD from Duke University under the direction of Elizabeth Clark. Her primary concerns are, or research area, are asceticism, monasticism in early Christianity, and especially a focus on Egypt. But she's also well known for her work in the field of digital humanities. She makes Coptic literature available through the interdisciplinary online research platform Coptic Scriptorium. And I'm not surprised that she was hired by the Oklahoma University to help other people deal with these difficult questions of digital humanities. Before publishing this particular book we're going to present, she published Monastic Bodies, Discipline and Salvation in Shinute of a Trip. Her list of publication is impressive and deals with these two main areas, early Christian asceticism and also Coptic sources and digital humanities. The book we're presenting today pinpoints the different scholarly attention granted to the presence of children in monastic communities during the Middle Ages and during late antiquity, while oblates are carefully studied for the Western Middle Ages. We cannot find equivalent studies for the Byzantine world. The impression given by some sources and most of the historiography is that children were largely not welcome in monastic communities who could refuse receiving them for fear they would not be able to follow the same diet and lifestyle as adult monks. And this is recorded in Syrian monastic sources, for example, or for fear they could represent sexual temptation for monks. This book addresses these questions and many more. This study summons a wealth of evidence drawn from documentary sources, from Egyptian papyri recording wills, petitions, contracts, or letters, to monastic rules, especially by Shinute and Pachomius, and finally to hagiography and art. It also includes a study of Jerome's letters and references to Cassian, both being present for a time in the East. These sources reveal an attention to children that goes into detail. For example, Shinute forbids placing children in front of the monks during prayer time because it would be a distraction. Pachomius insists that they are to be fed cooked food because they need more sustenance than adult monks. He clearly pays attention to their vulnerability. The book deals with children inside the monastic community, noting the difference between boys and girls in the sources. We know far less about girls than we know about little boys. And it also shows the different status of children, some of them being orphans, others left by their parents, given to the community, or for just a time in the community. One of the reasons for the presence of children in Shenute's federation of convents was that families joined monastic lives together. To break family ties, it was forbidden for monks and nuns to share their food with their own children, for example. Thus, the monastic community created an alternate family. At the same time, some parents left children in the care of monks, but just for a time. And the book studies the relation of the monastic communities with the larger society. And it's not just a study of the rules or a study of the papyrological evidence concerning children inside communities. It also includes the role of monastic communities in helping families. For example, healing children, sick children were brought to monks for exorcism or dealing with difficult cases. And so altogether, far from idealizing children, the book gives us an insight into a society where children could be seen as a burden, but also cherished. So now I will let Caroline comment the book by herself. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you. And I've been a fan of your work for a long time, Dr. Caseau. So it's an honor to have you chairing this session. And yes, thank you to the organizers for including my work. I am going to try to share screen if I can. I do have a couple little slides that have some images, which sometimes are nice, if that's okay. Thank you for those permissions. So as Dr. Caseau said, the book, the basic argument of the book is that, even though early Christian monks, renounced sex and family in order to become monks and join monasteries, there were children even in some of the earliest monasteries, and that in many cases they were expected to become monks themselves. Some of them may have been there temporarily, but much evidence says that monastic leaders expected these children to become monks themselves and to then be the next generation for the monastery. So there were these tensions in the early monasteries between that renunciation of family and children and then the responsibility of caring for the children in their care. And as Dr. Caseau alluded to, one of the things I look at is the particular crossroads that children lived on, where they were, in some ways, they were protected, right? They had stable home, shelter, medical care, food, education, right? So they were protected from some of the challenges of living in late antiquity, especially for people who were, poor or more economically challenged. But in other ways, they were still very vulnerable to the whims, desires, and ambitions of the adult monks. Children were on the lower rung of the family hierarchy, and children were not as important as adults in most late antique families, and also that's true in monasteries. So one of the challenges of the research of the book is looking at both of these pieces, how the sources value children as the next generation, how did monasteries ensure children's well-being, and then also some of the more difficult moments where children seem to be vulnerable to abuse or neglect even within the monastery. And I look, as Dr. Caseau mentioned, I look primarily at Egypt because Egypt is one of the birthplaces of Christian monasticism. And so, there has not been a book on this topic yet, although there's a lot of wonderful research on children in asceticism generally that's coming out now, which is really great. And as Dr. Caseau mentioned, the book looks primarily at Egypt, and here's a map for folks who don't work in Egypt of some of the monasteries that I study. And also I do look at the letters of Jerome and the monastic writings of John Cassian as figures who were very influenced by Egyptian monasticism and then also had children in their monastic communities. The book has kind of three parts. One, the first part is just simply like, how do we even know children were in these early monasteries? As Dr. Caseau alluded to in the introduction, a lot of the earlier literature from monasteries or about monasteries, especially the hagiography or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, suggests that there aren't children in monasteries. And so, for example, the saying from Macarius the Great, from the sayings of the Desert Fathers, when you see a cell built close to the marsh, know that the devastation of Scetis is near. When you see trees, know that it is at the doors. And when you see young children, take up your sheepskins and go away. And so that's that renunciation of family and the idea that children are a stumbling block to your asceticism is really strong in the literature. Nonetheless, there were actually children, even in the Desert Fathers, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, there are references to children. And certainly in the material from the Pachomian monasteries, and then also from the White Monastery Federation, led by the figure of Schroeder, there are many references to children. The hardest part is figuring out how they got there. There's not good references to how and why people enter monasteries generally, unless it's the hagiography. In the letters and rules material, there's not a lot about why people joined in Egypt. So much less about why children are there. So that was probably one of the hardest parts of writing the book is sifting through and trying to figure out how and why children were there. The second part of the book is about the symbolic weight of children in monastic literature, not so much when monks are writing about real live children, but sort of children as symbolism. So, one example is often, these stories, the theological or interpretive writings that mention the story of the binding of Abraham or the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter. And children appear in other ways as well in ascetical writings by monks. But that second part of the book is sort of about the symbolism of children. And then the third part is a social history of children. What were their daily lives? What was their education? What kind of relationships did they have with both their biological families or legal families who they might have joined a monastery with? We do have good evidence, especially at Schroeder's monastery, that families joined together. And the boys and men would be in the male communities, and the girls and women would be in the women's residence. So how did those relationships change once they joined the monastery? And then the conclusion looks at this idea of monasteries as families and institutions that stand the test of time, that have a past and a legacy and a future, and how children fit into that self-identity of the monastery in that way. So as I said, there's a lot of rhetoric about avoiding children, but nonetheless, there are children in these monasteries. And one piece of vulnerability is, the physical corporal punishment, right? And in late antiquity in general, children were beaten as a punishment. That's, known and widespread. And they certainly, in the white monastery of Shenouta, we do have evidence that children were, beaten as punishment. But then we also have this rule that appears where Shenouta says people who strike and beat children so that the children work, but then the adults neglect to do their work, even if the adults are able to do their work, those people are not righteous. And so you get this sense that, if Shenouda has to make this rule, don't be lazy and, not do your own work, but beat children to force them to do work, you get the sense that there may be an issue of adults, not treating children properly. On the other hand, as Dr. Caseau said, there is a lot of evidence for consideration for children needing more care, needing more food, 2 meals a day instead of 1 meal a day at Shenouda's community, the Pacomian community, extra food and bread, and then the story that Dr. Caseau mentioned, where in the hagiography of Pachomius goes and visits one of his monasteries, and a child complains that they haven't gotten cooked food. And the cook, the person in charge of cooking, says, well, the adults weren't eating it, so I stopped cooking it because the adults were all fasting. And Pachomius has to say, no, the children need food, need cooked food. So you see this tension between needing to care for children and their special needs and their importance as the future of the monastery, and then also their vulnerability. And then the last thing I want to say about the book, another challenge was studying girls, both girls and boys. As we know from studying late antiquity, those of us who work in late antiquity, studying women is often harder than studying men because there are fewer sources about them, fewer sources by them. And this is true, and even more true when you talk about children. There are just so few references to girls. So there is some evidence that they, are there in the monasteries. They have slightly different tasks that they're responsible for, but it is much harder to get a sense of what's going on with girls. So with that, I will stop screen sharing, and I'm happy to take any questions.